Evolution, Chapter 21, 16 for a Minute. Watching Cash and JT get read the riot act by Magister Patellidae and several generals was actually hilarious. Much funnier than nearly getting her ass kicked by Siphon because of them. They were placed under a government watch and on probation by the plumbers. Jen knew that the watch was more of a deterrent than anything else. They both looked scared straight as they were escorted out of the base. Jen sighed and spun in her chair as Patellidae approached her. He raised what passed for an eyebrow. "They're mostly harmless. Just complete idiots," she said, waving at the retreating figures. Patellidae nodded. "Protocol says we ought to have them tossed into the null void for impersonating officers of the law. The only reason we didn't is because you have as much pull as you do." Jen nodded. They wouldn't last a day in the null void. They confessed their crimes and agreed to pull all the footage from the web. In the end, no real harm done. We got Siphon behind bars, severely damaged on the power front, and the Knights didn't get away with the power core or the gun. Today's a win. Which I can't say for the last time we faced Agagor, so let me bask in it for a minute. Patellidae nodded and sighed. "We're still looking for him, and the next piece of the map." Jen nodded. Patellidae had been transferred to Earth after Max had been injured by Agagor. The main base's official move to Earth was being sped up. The agreement was coming to a final conclusion, and the consensus was to gradually transition Earth to an open system. It was going smoothly as it could be without Max, who was still in the regen chamber on Galvin Mark II. Patellidae had been informed what was happening, though no one else knew the exact details. He sat down next to her. "You know, you can't win 'em all." Jen nodded slightly and stood. "I know. You hear any whisper of Agagor," Patellidae nodded, "you'll be the first to know." She nodded and made her way down the hall to one of the few quiet places in the base. Construction was almost complete, but there were more plumbers here than there ever had been, and more seemed to arrive daily. She sighed as she sat down on the floor of the Hall of the Fallen facing Ethan's name. She shook her head and buried her head in her hands. She didn't cry. She wasn't sure if she was capable of that anymore. She was reasonably certain she'd cried every tear she had when Ethan had died. She had no idea how long she sat there. It was one of the few places she didn't know didn't bother her. It was nice to know that the job of saving the world was one she wasn't shouldering alone anymore with the influx of the plumbers. It made it easier to leave at a moment's notice to go after Agagor. But finding out that the plumbers seemed to be comprised of her personal fan club these days wasn't as easy to handle. They kept looking to her to lead. These were beings who were much older than her, depending on the species by nearly 50 years or more. It threw into sharp perspective all of the people she was failing when she lost to people like Agagor. She sat in silence for a while until someone joined her. A bag was set down next to her, so it was nearly leaning against her, and she looked up. Pierce was sitting next to her, holding a cup carrier. He smiled slightly. "Saw you were down here. Figured you probably hadn't eaten yet." She glanced down at the grease-stained bag and smiled slightly. "Thanks, Pierce." She pulled a bacon cheeseburger out of the bag and grinned at the extra-large order of chili fries. He sat down next to her, setting down the drinks, and the second bag in his other hand. He pulled out a burger of his own and a regular order of fries. They ate in silence for a few minutes before Pierce spoke up. "You know, we have a rec room here now. They've even finished it. Really nice, too, so why come down here?" Jen shrugged. "It's quiet. Nobody bugs me here. Nobody I don't know, anyway." Pierce raised an eyebrow. Jen frowned. "Oh, Miss Tennyson, since your grandfather's not here, you need to look over these requisition forms, even though the actual magister is less than 10 feet away," Jen said in an exaggerated accent. She stabbed her straw into the lid of one of the cups. Pierce nodded slightly. "Makes sense. They look up to you." Jen rolled her eyes. "Most of them are twice my age. I can't even legally vote, Pierce. Why am I the one everyone has to look up to? I'm a fuck-up waiting to happen." Pierce shook his head. "We both know that's not true." Jen glared at him. "Really? Because if it wasn't for me, Agrigor might never have gotten his hands on those aliens again. Not to mention the first part of the thing he needs to gain the literal powers of a god. Then there's the fact that I couldn't even protect my own damn boyfriend. Her voice seemed to vanish. Pierce shook his head. None of us could have stopped that. He would never want you to blame yourself for that. His words were soft, but chiding. Jen shook her head and ran her hands through her hair. I know. Her voice was quiet. He almost didn't hear it, even in the deserted hall. I know I shouldn't even think about what ifs, but it's hard not to. Pierce nodded. You know, I think like that a lot, too. If I had done more to figure out about the aliens Helen, Manny, and I were tossing into the null void, if I hadn't ended up in the void, if I'd found a real plumber before Max. He shook his head. None of it matters now. All that matters now is what we do. He stood and took a deep drink from his own soda. You know what I need? Jen shook her head, stuffing the last of her fries into her mouth. A normal movie. Want to come with? Just be 16 for one night. Jen looked up at him and nodded. I'd like to be normal for once. She borrowed Pierce's hoodie so she wouldn't be recognized, and he put on an ID mask to hide his spikes. They decided to go see something that was so far off their normal lives and ended up at the latest Disney release with the biggest bucket of popcorn they could find and several large boxes of candy. They laughed and cried and left the theater feeling normal for the first time in a long time. Thanks, Pierce. I needed that. Pierce nodded. Anything for a friend. She dropped him back at the base before driving home. Only when she arrived did she realize she'd forgotten to give him back his jacket. She shrugged. She'd give it back to him the next day. It was just nice to not have anything expected of her for a few hours. Chapter 22, Positive Side Effect. Gwen had no idea what Jen was planning when she placed Goop's anti-gravity device in place of the piece of the machine stolen by Agrigor. Goop melted to the floor, but didn't stay there long. She was drawn up into the machine, and a blood-curdling scream filled the cavern. It went on and on as the green sludge that currently comprised her cousin spun round and round again and again. Then it peaked, and Goop vaporized into the machine and the water itself. Gwen screamed as her cousin's final cry echoed around them. Pike glanced at the readout on the screen. The planet's stabilizing. Gwen turned to Kevin. There has to be a way to save her. She demanded it, but Kevin shook his head. Gwen, she atomized. Scattered through the entire ocean. There's nothing there to save. Tears blossomed from Gwen's eyes, and Kevin caught her as her knees buckled. She saved the whole world. He tried to comfort her, but it was hollow. She'd saved worlds before, and had more left to do. It really didn't help when Pike spoke up as one of his fellow Pisceus Valon handed him a second water helmet. Only part of the world, I'm afraid. Most of it's still floating off into space. Then the water on the screen moved, but not in the way normal water moved. It reached out, pulling the floating blobs back into itself as the scaled people called out the statistics of the stabilizing planet. Kevin pulled Gwen to her feet. Gwen shook her head. That's moving just like... Gwen fell silent as Kevin pulled up a microscopic scan of the water. Well, good news is that your cousin isn't dead. But she may be a permanent part of the planet. Gwen looked over his shoulder. The readout did in fact find traces of goop in every current molecule of the planet that pulled itself back together even as they watched. What happens when the watch times out? Gwen asked as the oxygen fish circled their feet happily. Kevin absently petted it as he turned to her, shaking his head. Whatever happens, we should be about to find out. There's no way the charge will last much longer. She switched, 4 times and went ultimate? No way it's lasting much longer. Gwen went pale as the planet fully coalesced back to its previous state. The water flashed green, and so did the anti-gravity device in the machine, but it did not vanish as it normally did. But Gwen could no longer feel any of her cousin within it. It was just a piece of the whole machine now. Jen, though, was somewhere out in the water with no protection. It took them nearly 10 minutes to find her, and Gwen's control was fraying. She thought she knew what they would find as the platoon of guards floated her cousin into the still-flooded hold of Rust Bucket 3, never once actually touching her. Between the grateful people of this world, they'd gotten the ship patched while Gwen and Kevin searched for Jen. Kevin vented the water out of the hold, and the two of them ran into the room. But what they found made them pause. Jen's eyes were open and glowing a solid green. The lines of code were painting her skin again. Gwen hesitated before she reached out to touch her cousin. The green vanished, and Jen convulsed, spewing water from her lungs. She coughed as Kevin's brain caught up to him, and he grabbed a respirator from a nearby med kit and shoved it over her face. The plumber's version of this device was special and drew out the obstruction in the way of breathing before feeding fresh air into the lungs. From the amount of water she spat up, Kevin could swear she'd swallowed half the planet. But in a moment, her hacking, heaving coughs eased into breath, and Gwen pulled her cousin into her arms. Her eyes met Kevin's over Jen's shoulder, concern and confusion meeting between them. They made Jen stay in the medical bay on the respirator on the way back to Earth. Kevin didn't want to bring it up first. "She should have died." Gwen's words were louder than she'd meant them to be. Kevin nodded. "Yeah, but she didn't." Gwen nodded. "Which is a good thing," she stated as she adjusted a scanner needlessly. "A very good thing," Kevin agreed almost robotically. "But she should have died." Kevin frowned at Gwen's insistence. She was right, of course. He flicked on the autopilot and turned to the redhead. "They never touched her." Gwen turned to him and frowned. "What?" "The guard. They were afraid to touch her, so they didn't. They used tech to float her in." Gwen nodded. Kevin's brain was racing. What if she was just stuck inside the Omnitrix when it figured out she was dying? Cooper says that it puts her in sort of a mobile stasis, if it's like when she was fixing the DNA, anyway. But she came back when you touched her, and she was drowning. Gwen nodded. "So, if the Pisces Valon had touched her, she would have drowned?" Kevin shrugged. "Maybe. We've all sort of agreed that none of us know how the Omnitrix works." Gwen nodded at him. "Does that mean she can't die?" Kevin shook his head. "No, probably. Look, most tech has some kind of failsafe to keep it from being destroyed. I think that might have been the Omnitrix's version of that. Like a quick save in a video game." Gwen ran her hands through her hair. "And your theory is, the minute she gets touched, the quick save ends?" Kevin shrugged. "You got a better explanation?" Gwen shook her head. "No, and that's what scares me." They made it back to Earth nearly 12 hours later, and Jen crashed in the med bay on a respirator for the rest of the night and well into the next day. She griped that she was fine, but Gwen and Kevin insisted, both spooked by the events of the previous day.